Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Ramsay Centre event series. My name is Martin Fahy. I'm the CEO of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization. On what is a glorious Sydney evening, it seems a shame to have to come inside. I'd like to recognise tonight that we have a number of the board members from the Ramsay Centre. I'd like to thank them for their support. They've been wonderful. I'm now in this 7th month of my tenure as Ramsay CEO, and it's been incredibly enjoyable. And just recognise the support of the board and the staff. Events like tonight are not possible without the generosity of our benefactor, Paul Ramsay. I think he would be really pleased about this event, that we're going to have an informed, intelligent, civil conversation in the public square about a phenomenon that has, in some respects, defined this country. As an immigrant born overseas, I've had first-hand experience of what it is to come here with young families, not out of necessity, but out of choice, and making that choice in the early 2000s, and what it is to experience the embrace of Australian society in all its ways. Tonight we're going to delve into the complexities of that. Our current population in this country contains 30% currently born overseas. That's right out at the edge of developed countries. The numbers in the UK and the US are high teens, depending on how you count. And so we stand head and shoulders. And it's been in that direction, with the exception of the sort of post-war era for a while. It's been in the 20s and 30s all along. And we've managed to achieve, I think, a level of social harmony that stands out uniquely within Western developed countries and OECD countries. I think the question is, what is the social compact that holds that together? Our two guests tonight have different views on that, and we are going to have a very interesting and stimulating conversation. And so I'll give some background on our speakers. Bernard Salt AM is one of Australia's leading social commentators. We had the pleasure of both being at the same global professional services firms for a number of years as partners. It was the blue one, by the way, in case anybody's wondering. Bernard founded the Demographic Group in 2017 to provide advice on demographics, and many of you have been his clients. Many of you have brought him to speak to your boards. I know, when we were together at KPMG, Bernard was the first call for boards looking out and looking to predict the future and understand trends. He is public enemy number one among Gen Z for his statements about the fact that they might forego smashed avocado in the interests of saving for their housing deposit. On a regular basis, he baits them with this on a Saturday morning in The Australian, and they duly respond in hordes and scream their outrage at him. The Australian is where he writes on a twice-weekly basis, and he was awarded his AM in 2017 as part of the Australia Day Honours. As I said, he's a leading demographer, I think, who brings to life what can be sometimes very staid and boring ABS statistics. Very few of us sit there waiting for quarterly ABS data and statistics, but Bernard does. Our other speaker tonight, and whom I'll be in conversation with, is Professor James Curran, Professor of Modern History at the University of Sydney and a fortnightly foreign affairs columnist at the AFR. So we've got both of our newspapers of record represented here tonight. He's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences and a fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. He's also, I think, a thorn in public intellectuals' life. James, I think, has brought a thoughtful, inquisitive, and very unique perspective to international relations in this country. He has challenged, I think, much of the thinking that's informed our perspective, whether it's on the Middle East, whether it's on China and other areas, and remains a very, very important commentator. The way tonight's going to work is Bernard will deliver an address over about 40 minutes, take us through the fact base and the evidence, what's actually happened. Most of us are familiar with the sort of overall trend as to how we've got to the population we have today, but he's going to unpack some of the major events, some of the policy choices, and then explore what that has meant for, multiculturalism here, the experiment, assimilation, all of those things, and will, I think, posit a thesis around what it is the social contract consists of. Bernard will then take a seat, and James and I will have a conversation and reflect on what Bernard has talked about, whether James agrees with Bernard's characterization of that, what holds it together, what role the myth, the narratives, the key issues? What are the key inflection points that we've looked at? I'm hoping James is taking note of these questions right about now, so he's prepared. And then we will move back to Bernard, interactive Q&A, and then we'll go to you in the floor. I should remind people, tonight's event is being recorded. It's my great pleasure to ask Bernard Stolt to join us on the podium to give us an overview of Welcome to Oz, the story of Australian immigration 1788 to 2100. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin, for that introduction. And yes, I am thrilled to actually be here. And the title, I love big ideas, and I've got a couple for you tonight. And even being bold enough to look out to the end of the century, we're already a quarter of the way through the 21st century, I think we should be, especially Australians, should be looking at the really big picture and thinking about the kind of nation and the ways in which we're going to generate prosperity going forward. All of that, I'm going to put some propositions out there in my presentation tonight. I want to start by asking a really big picture perspective question. Is Australia a good place to be? Should you invest your youth, your energy, your career, your life into the Australian continent over the next 10 years? You have skills, you could pack up and go to any country on earth, pretty much. Why should you commit to Australia? I say that you should, and here is my evidence for this. A new set of data was released by the UN Population Division. They're the authority on demography, and they do this every 2-3 years or so, and they look out to the end of the 21st century. This is world population from 1900, Federation from us, through to 2020, I think it is. And the point here is that you can see that, that 4 billion in about 1976 through to today doubled over that time frame. It's like a 45-degree ski jump, in fact. So everyone in this room was either born in that period or certainly developed their career in that period. And we have become used to nice, deep labour pools to pick and choose our labour from. That's normal to us. But the future is very different. Here is the latest perspective of the next 75 years globally from the UN. And the interesting thing here is that the 45-degree ski jump plateaus out. It reaches a peak, a technical peak. I've called it peak humanity in 2084 at 10.4 billion people. Every time they update this, that peak comes a little closer, and it's a little flatter, in fact. But I think you can say, actually, it's very interesting because when you look at this looked like a bell curve to me. And they've chopped it off at the most interesting part. What does this look like in the 22nd century? It was actually the topic of my column in The Australian last weekend, in fact. But when you look at this, going from 8 to 10, that's 2 billion net extra people on the planet on a base of 8. So that's a 25% increase. So does that mean we need to increase the production of food, energy, resources, commodities, space, security, lifestyle? Well, probably yes. Which countries on the planet deliver food, energy, resources, commodities, space, security? That's us. We have what the rest of the world will want, must want, will need over the next 50 years or so. That makes us a valuable commodity. You could argue that it makes us a vulnerable commodity when you look at it like that, in fact. And I think, 25% increase. I have great aspirations for the Australian people, continent and economy. I want 40%. I want to take a greater share of food production in the future. Does that mean that we should be thinking about the scale of Fremantle Port, which sends wheat overseas, or Geelong Port? Does that mean that we should be thinking about agribusiness assets? There is no global agribusiness business in the top 10 of our biggest corporate assets in Australia, BHP and the banks and whatever it is. You have to go to number 25 to get to an agribusiness business. And if you go around Australia to the towns in the interior, as I have, they'll tell you that the abattoir's been bought by Cargill's out of Minnesota, or JBS out of Brazil, or Fonterra out of, it should be Australians going over there. This is an opportunity. Where is Australia going to get prosperity going forward? I say it should be agribusiness. This is an opportunity for us going forward. And there's another data set I love about the UN is this little squiggly line. It is world grain production, wheat, barley, rice, corn, whatever it is. The scale's on the right. 1960, about 1 billion tonnes for 4 billion people. It's now about 3 billion tonnes, or a million is it? Whatever it is, billion tonnes, for 8. And you think, oh, it's very interesting. So if we're going to go up another 25%, that's got to go up there like that, hasn't it? That's right, we'll just plant out all the unused arable land on the planet. Well, there is none. What does that do to a product like Australia? In fact, this is why you would have faith in the future of Australia. I think there are issues we need to focus on, like the development of corporate assets, global assets, global agribusiness businesses, I would love to see. We have the world's biggest mining company. Of course we have the biggest mining company, BHP. No other nation on the planet controls the resources of an entire continent. We do. I mean, if we have to outsource that to someone else, we need to give the game away. And I'm saying agribusiness is a major source of prosperity going forward. Let's take this further. Another data set was released in October. This one from the International Monetary Fund. They have for 40 years estimated the GDP for every country on Earth. And it's expressed in US dollars. Here are the richest countries on Earth last calendar year, as measured by the IMF, in US dollars, of course. I've shown you only the top 21 out of 195. And your eye will go to number 11, of course. My point here is that I get it about the cost of living and so forth. I mean, it's very, very important, whatever. But you would need to move our GDP per capita by 10% up or down to move one notch. We are going to be in about the 10th or 11th richest country on Earth. The richest country on Earth should deliver world's best practice healthcare, education services, quality of life, when you think about it. We generate the prosperity on a per capita basis. I get it that it's not evenly distributed or fairly distributed, but that would also apply in every other country on Earth when you think about it. So, and you think, oh, it's sort of interesting. So we're number 11, 195 countries. Wonder what that looked like in 1994. Well, I've gone back to 1994 to the UN, to the IMF databases. We did not rank at number 11. We ranked at number 20. We have ratcheted our way up the rankings over the last 30 years. You do not rise or fall in these rankings without some sort of tectonic force pushing you up or pulling you back. In fact, what could that be? I say it's globalisation. It is us, rightly or wrongly, it's another debate, selling coal, gas, iron ore to China and agribusiness, wheat, in fact, that led to the wealthification of Australia. You think, oh, you know, what a time to be, say, 30 years old in 1994, right time in history, in fact. And you think, well, where have we spent our wealth and prosperity? Because it's so much it should hit you right between the eyes, and I think it does. I think we've spent our wealth and prosperity on housing, on quality of life, on lifestyle. Travel, we're a colonial people, we measure travel. Superannuation, established in what, 1992 or 1993, you would say. Quality of life. And I will come back to that quality of life, lifestyle, which I think is our sell point and which I think is at the core of our social compact with immigrants and with the Australian people and with each generation, in fact. Let's move this forward and look at the Australian population. Modern Australia, European Australia, of course, from 1788. In every respect, we are all immigrants to the Australian continent. There are 16 people that arrived between 1832 and 1855 that produced me, just over 100 years later, in fact. And they arrived from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Bavaria. I know exactly where they've come from. And I say that the opportunities I have had in life have been because of the Australian population or generosity, in fact, 2 degrees under Whitlam. I think I've paid it back in tax though over the years. So there we are. We're currently at, it's actually 27.6, so I've rounded it to 28. The official view, the median projection by the ABS, they do this once every 5 years. So it's a 2-year-old projection. They won't update it until 2027. That's the official view. It sets the agenda for all government departments, just under 40, 39.6. And the UN has a projection going through for Australia right through to the end of the century. Whether it's right or not just gives you a sense of where it is, 45 or so. And then the proportion of the population born overseas on the Australian continent, 1891, of course, just at the time an extraordinary recession, depression at that time. And then as the next generation were born on the Australian continent, that reached a low point to just after the war, 1946, at 10%. After the war, the great immigration program, of course, the Greeks, the Italians and others, of course. And it currently sits at 30, or in fact in 31. That figure is updated every 12 months. The next figure will be released for the 2024 calendar year on the 30th of April at 11 a.m. I'll be right on the button. And I think the 2023 figure was actually 31%. I think the 2024 figure might be even 32%. In fact, you could say 1/3 of the Australian population was born outside the Australian continent. It includes, I'm going to use very round numbers, it includes 1 million students and backpackers and others. If you're here for 13 months or more, you're counted as part of our resident population. It's standard practice. I mean, you're using water, sewage, roads, facilities and whatever, so it's a fair measure. And it's a fair exchange because there's about 1 million Australians living in London and New York and whatever it is, in fact. So you think, 30%, that kind of sounds like a lot. I'll come back to that and do some benchmarks around Australia and show you how extraordinary that figure is and how our immigration is unique at a global level, in fact. Let's have a look at net overseas migration. So excess of births over deaths. You look at the fertility rate. The peak number of babies women typically had was 1960, peak of the baby boom, 3.6 births per woman. It's now down to 1.5, so it's less than half. In Hong Kong at the moment, it's 0.7. So developed world, you could probably say, is going to keep on going down like that. And then net overseas migration. This is net overseas migration to the Australian continent. Net, so outflow minus inflow. So it's adding to the population. And you can see, the 1891 and whatever. You can see the diggers leave to go to Egypt for Gallipoli. And then you can see the diggers coming back. And, the depression and whatever. And then after the war, it all changed, of course. And was that about 100? Could you say about 100,000 per year? Very, very roughly. Until about 2009 or so. And then it was the studentification of Australia. So wheat, iron ore, gas, coal, wool, students generated our wealth and prosperity. And so the whole Big Australia debate, 2009, first comment of Julia Gillard when she was appointed Prime Minister, made Prime Minister, was, "I do not believe in a big Australia." It was a big issue at the time. And net overseas migration during that time, it was myself and Dick Smith fighting it out on that. And the peak was 300,000. The figures we have just seen are up over 500,000. But really, it's a yo-yo effect. All the students went home, all the students came back. It will settle down and is settling down, in fact. But the ABS is now running with a medium projection net overseas migration of 225. Back in the early 2000s, the median was 180. And in the 1990s, it was about 120. So the ABS has been stepping up its median assumption. And you could say, well, 225 right through to the end of the century is the... No, demographers won't do any sort of black swan events. It's just they'll make an assumption, they'll just run it all the way through, in fact. Let's have a look at that bizarre figure of Australia, the 30%, 31%, maybe 32%. And let's have a look at some benchmarks. There's Australia in the middle. That is a 2020 figure, which was the last time the UN produced their world migration data document. They're due to update it, and they should have updated it, I would have thought, about 2 years ago, but it's been delayed for some reason. I don't know what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years or so where you wouldn't want to measure this, because I think you would want to measure this. In fact, so 30%. New Zealand's right up there with us, Canada's 21%, but the US was 15% in 2020. We've had the southern border issue over the last 4 years. There are 350 million people in America. You need 3.5 million people as immigrants in net terms in a year to move that by 1 percentage point. So there's no way it's anywhere near where we are. In fact, and you think, well, you know, at 30%, 31%, it's so big. It's like when a third of the population is kind of cosmopolitan, then it starts to impact and shift the thinking. You actually end up with a fusion culture. And I think that is exactly what we have, in fact. I think that the Greeks and the Italians really struggled in the 1950s, 1960s. By the 1970s, they were starting to be absorbed. And so in the 1960s, I was living in country Victoria and whatever. And I remember in the 1970s, there was an AFL footballer called Robert Dipper Domenico. And there was a song about Dipper Domenico. And I thought, what a fabulous song. And it was an engagement. All of a sudden, you had this sort of popular culture fusion of the Italian, I think it's Italian or Greek, element into Australia. And then our food palette shifted very, very quickly after that, in fact. So if you look at world leaders, they're mostly Middle Eastern states, city-states, and these are guest workers. They are not immigrants with the sovereign rights of So find me another place on the planet, anywhere, let alone of 27 million people, where it's at 30%. So Canada's probably the closest thing, I would say. There's something unique. How do you maintain social cohesion at 30%? There is something that is holding us together. I say it is the relentless, obsessive pursuit of lifestyle. That is where we have fused, in fact. Even the Italian concept of la dolce vita kind of fits with our, you know, she'll be right, mate, you know, or long weekend kind of culture. I think there's an alignment of fundamental core values of the Australian people. I'll come back to core values of the Australian people in just a moment. At the other end, you know, who doesn't take migrants? Well, and of course there are people who live in China who were not born in China, but the number is so small that it rounds down to zero. In fact, barely 2% of Japan's population was born outside Japan. So we are a world leader. If someone does it better, let us know, let me know, because I haven't found it, and I don't think we're going to find it. We are making this up as we go along. Doesn't mean it's not successful, it just means we're cutting new territory when you look at it like that. I love these big high altitude views of Australia. Very colourful map. Shows areas of population growth in blue, population loss in red, between the year 2000 and in fact through to 2023. And it responds to the question of what have the Australian people done with the Australian continent thus far in the 21st century? Because I think the Australian people are talking to us through this map. They are telling us about their obsessions, their priorities, their values. And I look at this map, these people are obsessed with lifestyle. Up the coast, down the coast, sea change, tree change is important. We have added 8 million people thus far this century, probably closer to 9 by 2025. 5 million from overseas, 3 million locally, and we've stuck them in the blue bits. And we've also scooped up 500,000 from the red bits and put those in the blue bits as well. Here is a nation of 27 million people where 8 and a bit million this century have clamoured into the lifestyle zone, when you think of it like that. The other point I'd make is, if you just look at wheat production, just take any grain at all, or anything in agriculture, year 2000, 25 million tonnes, 22 years later, 36 million. So that's what, a 44% increase. That's pretty good. We're heading to where I want to get to, which is agribusiness, up there with mining or whatever it is. You think, oh, how could... But we've lost 500,000 people, but we're producing that. How does that work? Agribusiness, automation, mechanisation, digitisation, dronification. There needs to be a word for that. The dronification, incredibly efficient farming, in fact. We should be world's best practice at producing, servicing agribusiness machinery in places like Dubbo and Wagga and Northam and Mount Gambier, in fact. We should be producing skills as diesel mechanics, hydraulics mechanics, in fact. If this is where we are going, we should have a TAFE system that recognises this grand vision for Australian prosperity, not in this electoral cycle, but 50 years into the future. Let's have a look. I love all sorts of maps. Here's a map on the right which shows the Sydney international destinations in one flight from Sydney. It was in December 2019, so you can get to 53 places. You can see all over New Zealand and the South Pacific. You can get to Santiago, a couple of places in the US, you know, and of course, in due course, that will get to New York and even Johannesburg. I think that is on the left. On the left is actually where we are today. So we're finally recovered from the pandemic. My point is, a very global people, in fact. Very interesting. You see the three destinations, two in India, and I think that is Sri Lanka, Colombo. Whereas prior to, it was only one destination. It gives you an idea of where our linkages are, in fact. And so I'm saying that our reach is expanding all the time, in fact. It's now direct flights from Perth to Paris, to London, to Rome, in fact. Here is the 20 biggest cities on the Australian continent in 1954 at the census. Bob Menzies, the Prime Minister, 9 million people on the continent, baby boom underway. Top five are still the top five. Kalgoorlie was the 20th biggest city in Australia. The Blue Mountains was considered to be a separate city to Sydney, and Ipswich was considered to be a separate city to Brisbane. When I look at this list, I see a colonial agricultural outpost of Britain at that time. It was probably about right in the mid-1950s. Let's just look 70 years into the future and an extraordinary immigration program and the wealthification of the Australian people. What have we done with our top 20 cities and the immigration that has forged that? Well, here it is. The sixth largest city did not exist in 1954. Neither did the Sunshine Coast, the Gold Coast, Port Macquarie, Coffs Harbour, Mandurah in the west, Victor Harbour in the form that we know them today, Central Coast, Surf Coast, Mornington Peninsula as lifestyle zones. If it is a central tenet of the Australian people that we are relentlessly pursuing lifestyle, and immigrants have said, we will have a piece of that, thank you very much. That aligns with our expectations. I'm from India, I've got a house and land on the western suburbs of Melbourne. I want exactly that lifestyle, that quality of life, that I cannot get anywhere else in terms of safety, security, job opportunities, global connectivity. The whole equation works for me, in fact. The goal is very interesting. So, you know, sort of lifestyle, outpost of Britain, lifestyle. Wonder what this looks like in 10 years' time. So I've bolted together the official view from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. You're going to have to trust me that I've got the right documents, made the right adjustments, made my own estimates where there were gaps in this, looked at 40 cities to come up with 20. Here they are. Here they are. Sydney and Melbourne, in fact, at 6 or so. By the 2050s, Melbourne and Sydney will have an 8 in front of it. So they're 5 now, going to 8. That's 3 on 5 as a growth factor. Sounds like a lot. Have a look at London. London is a city of 9 million people inside the M25. By the middle of the century, London won't have 9 million people, it'll have 10. It's 1 on 10, 1 on 9, or 3 on 5. Where are the greater opportunities going to be delivered? It would be in Australia, I would say. Fundamentally underpinned by immigration, I might add. These are median projections, not the high, not the low. In fact, very interesting to see Mackay. See, Launceston has sort of still growing, but it just hasn't kept pace with the rockets that are coming for it. So Mackay is in, Launceston out. There are two cities vying for number 20 at that time. One is Mackay, the other is Bunbury. Why are Bunbury and Mackay going gangbusters? They sit on the coast between a resource basin, Bowen Basin, coal basin, and export markets, in fact. So, colony of Britain, lifestyle and resources, in fact, and continued immigration. Rightly or wrongly, good or bad, whatever, that's where we're headed, I think. Here is the annual estimate of the number of people added, number of immigrant countries in Australia. So this is the top 12. These figures are 2023. These are the figures that will be updated on the 30th of April from the ABS at 11 o'clock. And, you know, at the top is, you know, the UK, kind of get that. When you think about it, UK has been a major source, the major source, not a, but the major source of immigrants to the Australian continent for 237 years. Look at the rate of growth of what's coming. So the Brits are contracting. Well, that's because when you look at the age profile, they're all 10-pound poms. They're on their 70s and 80s. So, you know, thank you for your contribution, but, you know, it's going to subside. But look at the Indian population. Is that 43%? Is that over 5 years? Is that 8% per year? Demographers get all excited when the Gold Coast grows at 2%. The Indian Gold Coast concept is growing by 8% per year, in fact. So there is a point, I think, before the end of this decade where the Indian population crosses the UK population. For the first time in a quarter of a millennium, Australia will have a new biggest source nation for immigrants, not Britain. Still the Commonwealth, but very interestingly, prior to the pandemic, it was China that was on this trajectory. China has slowed mightily. I don't know what the official reason is. I just think there's been a shift in thinking. So India, and not just India, but also the Philippines, Nepal and Pakistan. And you can, at the census, you can actually look at this on a city-by-city basis. So Melbourne attracts Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and people from Sri Lanka. And Sydney is Nepalese in particular. And Brisbane in particular, which I thought was unusual, was Columbia. And I think that's the students' element. Leads me to conclude that I think that, you know, a lot of these numbers are being driven by the marketing departments of universities. So they say where they've actually got their relationships. Like the Nepalese, you know, they're not in Melbourne. They're in pretty much everywhere else. They are right through, of course, the aged care industry. The Nepalese, the Filipinos and the Indians. The oldest baby boomer is 79. They're not really old yet. These numbers must increase from those source countries and perhaps others, in fact. The fastest growing job on the Australian continent at the moment is aged care, aged and disabled carer. It's been growing at 2,000 people per month in a net terms for the last 60 months. In fact, I think aged care worker will replace shop assistant as this nation's largest single job by the end of this decade. In fact, such is the shift. And so part of it is driven by immigration. So a third born overseas, get that, and there are the benchmarks with other nations. Yeah, we're unusual. Where do they live? I've I actually published this map in the Australian in August 2023. In fact, you hear politicians talking about Middle Australia. Well, I've measured Middle Australia using the average income per household for every neighbourhood on the Australian continent and worked out the number of people and the places that sit across the middle from the 30 percentile to the 70 percentile. So the middle 40% is green, the top 30% is in blue, and no surprise, it's eastern suburbs and up and down the coast, and complete dominance of the North Shore, in fact. When you look at Canberra, it is blue. It is entirely, there is no Middle Australia, there is no Battler Australia in Canberra. There's little specks, whatever, it's quite unique when you look at it. What I find interesting here, it's almost like a front you know, the sort of top 30% advancing upon Middle Australia, around that Macquarie Park area. And you see these little islands. You think it'd be great places for gentrification, wouldn't they? You see them also in Melbourne. That yellow bit in the eastern suburbs is Centennial Park. So good place to invest. There you are. Let's move on. So in other words, there's territories. You can actually map out the territories. And of course, the yellow bits in the southwest Sydney is predominantly the immigrant, first wave immigrants, in fact. Here are some of the foods that I grew up on in the 1960s in our commission house in country Victoria, a little town of 2,000 people. I had never heard of avocado. I had never heard of zucchini at that time. We drank tea. Didn't know there were types of bread. It was just white bread. If you had a birthday, I remember my 7th birthday, which had fairy bread, which was plain white bread, full fat butter and sprinkles, which is pure sugar, spread across the top. And you'd have Tarax soft drink to wash it down, and that was a treat, in fact. But when you look at this, and I've written about this in my column, growing up in the 1960s, we could have been in the East End of London, or in Liverpool, or in Manchester. The way we never ate outside. We didn't even have a barbecue. We had 1,000 square metres, a quarter-acre block. There was 6 kids and 2 parents. We always ate at the kitchen table, in the kitchen, in fact. And then, of course, the Greeks, the Italians arrived. By the 1970s, we started to drink out with tea, in with coffee, in with arugula, in with olive oil, and we started to kiss each other on the cheek. We are an extraordinarily absorbent culture, a little bit needy, a little bit conscious of the fact that we are remote and isolated and colonial, and we're very, very wanting to be sophisticated. And so, yes, I'll have that cappuccino. I remember it was about 15 years ago, the quinoa salad became a thing. And Australians didn't know how to pronounce quinoa. But as soon as they learned how to say quinoa, it was, I'll have the quinoa salad, thank you very much. It was a way of showing off your sophistication. I think that we use food as a way to accommodate or include immigrant cultures. Welcome to Australia, mate, what have you got to eat? Is our logic, in fact. Then, of course, in the 80s, I think the Vietnamese influence in the late 1970s, the boat people at that time. The green stuff at the top is bok choy, which I literally first saw in a Woolworths supermarket in Melbourne in 1998. Didn't know what it was. It's our local supermarket. We're still in the area. And I've watched that bay grow and develop. There's bok choy, choy sum, pak choy. There's a whole family of choys that it's mainstreamised. It took 20 years in the 1950s to get cappuccino across the line, and olive oil, and arugula, and then it's pacia all the time. In fact, we're loving it, is the point. And we love showing off to each other. It's a colonial people, well removed, that, yes, a natural alignment, I think. And from the Greeks and the Italians' point of view, yeah, well, I love this quality of life. La dolce vita, casa mia. In fact, look at the way in which they have adapted to and adopted the Australian values, and even play in Melbourne our football code, and do it pretty well too. And then more recently, of course, you have the Middle Eastern influences, Dhaka as an example, in fact. So I think this is very important to the Australians. Here is from the census the top 20 languages spoken at home. So you might speak English at work, but what's your core language? Top 20, and of course, number 1 is English. Mandarin is still there, of course. But the Chinese element in Australia, there's only really 2 versions of that. One is Cantonese, one is Mandarin. Whereas with Indian, it's 6. And there's actually more, but they don't make it to the top 20. You add up all the 6, that's 1 million. There's 1 million people speaking a dialect of an Indian population. And that's going to grow further into the future. And so I'd say, well, what are the Indian food influences? What are the Indian influences in design and fashion and the way you lay out a house, as an example? If my thesis of we are a fusion, absorbent culture, ever eager to showcase our sophistication, then you would see greater absorption of this into the future. This chart, if you're running a business and you're doing a strategic plan, you need to nick this chart. Credit it to me, please. And published in The Australian about 2 weeks ago. It shows the net change in the population by single year of age from birth on the left to 100 plus on the right between 2025 and 2035. It's produced by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It's as authoritative as you can get. You could argue it as an expert witness, is why I always look at it and think, well, so what that's saying is, I mean, another 3.5 million people, I think it'll be closer to 4. It's about 400,000 per year. It's probably about right. It's never the quantum. It's not the 4 million that is of interest. It's the bumps, because the bumps set the agenda going forward. There is a bucket load of 20-somethings coming. That's the studentification element. So more students, cafes, bars, restaurants, inner city apartmentia would be demanded by inner city students, you would say. The big one is the middle. These are the millennials. These are the peak at 47 in 10 years' time. So they're in this room today. They're 37 today. I think you go through a gateway in Australia in your late 30s. By your late 30s, you're partnered up. You have 1 or 2 or 3 kids. Your partner's gone back into the workforce. You all of a sudden, that inner city minimalist chic apartment in Bondi or St Kilda just doesn't do it for you. You need 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a front garden, a backyard, and a Zoom room. Where are you going to get that lifestyle? Because they were pursuing that lifestyle as singles and couples, living that friends, inner city Manhattan-esque kind of lifestyle. But in the next decade, it's about family, pre-teenage families and lifestyle. And I don't actually need to commute into the office anymore. This is at odds with city planning, which is densification. No, it could go much further, in fact, is what I'm saying here. Just to provide some contrast, so this is Australia with all our immigration and whatever it is. Here is the next 10 years, same concept for Japan. So if you're running a big business in Japan, you think, domestic market's done, I need to be looking further out, because it's going to contract. And in fact, if you think what demographics actually deliver taxation that underpin the stability of that country, you'd say, well, I'd have my money here rather than there. And in fact, you could do this it's a good example in Japan, of course, because it's going to contract by 7 million people over the next decade, in fact. Here is an important chart. It was put together by our data scientist, Harihara Priyakannan, Indian lady, who downloaded 17 censuses, PDF by PDF, to get a single figure. And what I wanted her to do was to show the proportion of the dwelling stock at every census conducted on the Australian continent since 1911. And what it shows is peak house, peak home ownership. So about 50% in 1911, the war, the depression, blah, 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 1947, whoosh, off like a rocket to a peak of 73%. In fact, I think there's a little thing. They changed the nature of the question in 2 censuses, and then they got back on track. So I think the trend is actually like that. And it just jumped up a bit for the last census in 2021 because of low interest rates at that time. But at the end of the day, we've conceded 10 percentage points to enable young people to live that inner city lifestyle, live as a single throughout their 20s rather than buying a house and delaying it, in fact. But again, you think, well, you know, this drives this whole sort of concept of, you know, the quality of life being the social compact between the generations and with immigrants, in fact. So there's a couple more to go. I really like this chart as well. I like all my charts, but this one's interesting because it shows what's coming down the pipeline for Australia. It shows over 100 years, it's only part of the chart, the number of people added to the 85 plus bucket. So more people coming in at 85 than dying, basically. So, and that goes to the issue of healthcare, nursing home care, and the staffing that goes with that. You think, from 1971 to 2024, I'll make it easy, it's about 10,000 per year. So you need to provide funding and support for about 10,000 more 85 plus year olds and all the stuff they need. Got that? Here is the ABS view of the next 50 years. In 2032, the first baby boomer ever invented, born in 1946, turns 85. Now, I don't know whether at 85 you suddenly need healthcare, but it's a fair bet. And you can see the way it's ratcheting up, in fact, and stays elevated for 20 years or so. You are going to need those Filipinos and those Nepalese and those Indians at scale going forward, in fact. Here is how all of this plays out in what is central to Australian values. This home, here is the kind of house, this is modelled on my childhood home in country Victoria. It's the quarter-acre block, 1,000 square metres, 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, outside loo, 6 kids, bunk beds for the boys and girls. Mum and dad works, mum's a housewife, that was the term at the time. If you wanted to visit this house, our house, you would go up the pathway onto a porch and then you turn right into the lounge room. The lounge room was a modern incarnation of the parlour. The parlour was the good room. The good room was where you entertained guests and suitors. Suitors never got near a bedroom back in the 1960s. Very different today, I can tell you. And off to the side is a mahogany side stand with a silver tea service. And the point of that is to showcase the wealth, the prosperity, and the values of the people that ran that household. Very English values. There is no outdoor space. There's not even a barbecue space outdoors. Here is how we live today. Here is how Middle Australia lives today after 30 years of globalisation and wealthification and continued immigration influences on the Australian people and continent. It's not 1,000 square metres, only 500 square metres. But it is 4 bedrooms, not 3, 2 bathrooms, not 1, 2 income earners, not 1, and 2 kids, not 4 or 6. If you wanted to visit this house, maybe your house, you wouldn't be taken to a good room at the front of the house. No, we've put the good room at the back of the house because we want to drag you right through the house to showcase our wealth and prosperity. It's the neediness. So you take your guess, for the first time in history, some guests now pass the open doors to the bedrooms, which means the bedrooms now must be glimpse perfect. And this has led to the pillowification of the bedroom. Not 2 pillows, not 4 pillows, but 6 pillows, plus a little square cushion that is set to diamond effect exactly in the... I don't know what happens if you square up that diamond. No male has ever been game to touch that cushion. And then you take your guests and you mill around an island bench, which means the island bench must move up market. It's now marble, Italian marble in waterfall style. Rising out of the centre of it will be a silver German gooseneck tap. Tapware is now the new silverware. The back veranda has been completely made over. It now goes by the very sophisticated Milan-esque term of al fresco space. Not even space, just al fresco, in fact. Because when the Greeks and the Italians arrived in the 1950s, they would have looked at that house on the left and thought to themselves, what the hell are those Australians doing living in an English house? They have a Mediterranean climate. They should have indoor-outdoor living. You're right. It made sense. It connected. And we changed immediately, as well as our palate and our affectations of kissing each other on the cheek, in fact. In the 1960s, I remember when we'd go to church, mass, and if a male was introduced to a female, he would sort of stand there and do the whole Georg von Trapp thing, click his heels, and you would never actually kiss someone or even shake their hand at that time. So the al fresco, and the 4th bedroom is now given over to what real estate agents are calling a Zoom room. And so I say, I could find that house, a version of that house in Penrith. I think I could go to the suburbs of Dubbo, the suburbs of Cairns, the suburb of Bunbury, the suburbs of Launceston, and find that house. If that is true, then this is a cultural truth about the Australian people and how they want to live. And does it align with the values of the Indians and the Chinese and the Filipinos and the Nepalese? Because I say, tick, 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 tick. We offer what they want. We are choosing from them what we want, that we think adorns and embellishes our lifestyle. In fact, and I don't see it changing, is the point. And then some key points which I have put. We are a rich country. The 30% figure is bizarre, but I think we achieve it because we both get something out of the exchange. Cultural sophistication and quality of life, lifestyle, is the point. And I think we will be accommodating immigrants through to the end of the 21st century, through to 2100, in fact. So, whether that proportion still sits at 30% is another question. We could have another session talking about what's happening in the 22nd century, but I think that's a step too far. So thank you very much.
Bernard's characterisation, it's very positive. The relentless pursuit of lifestyle, it conjures up an image of, no sort of, we're all happy, we're all satisfied, there's no economic deprivation, there's no tensions. Do you agree with his characterisation?
Well, I think, for the best part of the last 50 years, there's been a lot of hand-wringing and hair-pulling about what constitutes the Australian identity. And many people, be they ministers for nationalism or prime ministers or community leaders, have ransacked the back catalogue of Australian history searching for some kind of myth or idea which explains how Australia holds together as a community or a people. And in many ways, a lot of those ideas have been found wanting, either for popular acceptance or their lack of popular acceptance or lack of conceptual legitimacy. I mean, even just to take a few of them, in the 70s, the Eureka Stockade incident was tried, ludicrously dressed up in the borrowed robes of American Independence Day or the storming of the Bastille. Gallipoli is another favourite that's been tried. Had more success in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, I think, the Anzac legend, but we can come back to that. The Bodyline cricket series was tried at one point. There'd been all sorts of attempts. The Bush legend, but the Bush legend was, I think, seen to be sort of at odds with the urbanisation that we saw so dramatically in those charts. It was a bit replete with male chauvinism. It was a bit exclusive. It had quite a lot of racism in it. There was a historian in the late 50s, Russell Ward, who wrote a book called The Australian Legend. It's the only attempt by an Australian historian to craft a national mystique which owes nothing to a British heritage. And yet, when the whole idea of being British collapsed in the 60s or 70s, that myth wasn't taken up, wasn't seen as sufficiently unifying for some kind of new idea of community. So it may well be that what Bernard is talking about in terms of, Australians, as I say, have been fretting about what holds them together. Canada does a lot as well. Go into any Canadian bookshop, look at the amount of books you find about what it means to be a Canadian. And read the editorials every Australia Day in the major newspapers. There's this agonising over what it is that holds the community together. Now, whether or not it is this sense of the home, I think that's an important part of it. I guess my question would be, what kind of pressures will social cohesion be able to bear as we go forward into the rest of this century and beyond? Housing we know is very difficult in terms of access for young people. We've got governments around the world who are, not only in the United States, we've had it in Britain with Brexit, we've got it right across Europe, in many of the countries there. this sense of the core culture being under siege, and the sense that some countries are feeling as if their national essence is under threat, right? So I think, Australia's productivity problem is serious and has been serious for a number of decades, and it doesn't seem to me to be getting any better, notwithstanding a Cheshire Cat treasurer on the 7:30 last night. We've got to get the transition to green energy right. Living standards have got to rise. Wages are going up, but there are all these sorts of, I think, socio-economic pressures which might bring, as I say, a bit more tension and strain on this idea. But one thing I agree, and we can talk about this, but one thing that's worth bearing in mind too is the extraordinary transformation that those graphs show. I mean, that big dip down to 1950. What was the rate of immigration in 1950? I mean, the 10%?
It was 10% in the 1947 census. Yeah.
So bear in mind the extraordinary transformation that has taken place. Now, the foundational principle of this country, the very first act passed by the Federal Parliament, was the Immigration Restriction Act, otherwise known as the White Australia Policy, thanks to George Reid. When Australia experienced, like other Western countries, the coming of mass nationalism, the need for that intense social identity, that era threw up two questions: who are you and to whom do you belong? And the Australians, the colonists, and then the Australians' answer at that time was, we're white and we're British. And the historian W.K. Hancock in 1930 said, white Australia was the indispensable condition of every other policy. Down to the 1950s, you could not be elected to the federal parliament if you stood on a platform of wanting to unravel or unpick white Australia. Now, through the 50s and 60s, there were modifications by degrees. Bureaucrats in the External Affairs Department and immigration started to pick away at the policy. Decolonisation was swinging through Asia and Africa, creating a lot of newly independent nations. Australia was on the nose in Asia, despite the Colombo Plan and the 1957 trade agreement with Japan. It was on the nose because it was keeping Asians out. Australia spent the Cold War fighting Asians in Asia, in Korea, Malaya and Vietnam. That intensified, in many ways, the governments of that period sticking to this policy of discrimination. In 1964, when then Minister for Immigration Hubert Opperman started to try and press Menzies into changing the policy, just some tweaks which would allow non-Europeans to stay a bit longer than the periods for which they'd been allowed, Menzies said, no way, this is the right sort of discrimination. Why would we tinker with discrimination when our aim is a homogenous population? Now, as Holt said, we had to wait for the old man to go. And Holt brought in critical changes in the late 60s. Think about this change, that in 1967, Harold Holt said, thankfully the things that used to define us in the past are gone. British imperialism and white Australia, he said, have just dropped away into the mists. Quite a haunting phrase when you think about it. 10 years later, Malcolm Fraser was saying, we're a country that's small in size, insular in outlook. We've stumbled into the multicultural era. And then that really, I think, sort of starts, that gives you a sense of the trap, I think, that Australia found itself in, which is why I'm referring to this agonising over identity, which I think Bernard has in part answered. That is, Australia was caught. It had a political heritage that explained its past, that is, its British heritage, but was not culturally sustaining. And it had the imperative of celebrating ethnic diversity and multiculturalism, but it had no reliable shorthand for explaining the singularity of the nation. So you get all these attempts from the 70s onwards by leaders, bureaucrats, culture makers, artists, to try and give some kind of definition to the nation, but they are caught fundamentally between those two imperatives, right? So the key thing about this, though, is that Australia's got along quite well without having a kind of on-the-shoulder nationalism, without the pounding of chests and the beating of drums. We've actually survived quite well. Yes, there have been, as we all know, incidents in the 80s, 84 with the Geoffrey Blaney comments, John Howard's comments in 87 about slowing down the rate of migration, Pauline Hanson. But at no real point have those incidents, not Cronulla either, in 2005, have they challenged in any fundamental way the pillars of the multicultural ideal. I'm not suggesting it's perfect. Keating and Howard didn't like the word. But it's been able to stay, I think, because of the institutional gift, if you like, of the British heritage. Rule of law, free press, parliamentary democracy have created, adapted to Australia's experience, have created those environments.
Lot there. Let's unpick a little bit. No, that's great. In terms of stress testing it, though, if you get 30 years of economic prosperity and you've got, you know, an enormous amount of natural endowed resources and the physical space, the sense in which it gets stressed, it doesn't get subjected to the same stresses that you see in continental Europe, where you've got unemployment rates, etc. Is the relentless pursuit of lifestyle, is it enough to, if it's subjected to stresses and strains?
Well, look, obviously that remains to be seen. I mean, one of the things that is another potential problem, and which we're seeing certain signs of over the last 5 to 8 years, especially given the kind of whole fear of China and the way in which that debate has played out, you know, there is a real risk that Australia's growth and its living standards may well be adversely affected if it gets sucked into what a professor at the ANU, Shiro Armstrong, calls mission creep. That is, if the debate over economic security pushes Australia down more and more down a protectionist path, or what they call friendshoring, that is, we'll only trade with like-minded countries. Now, for certain industries, that is absolutely necessary. Australia must draw a red line on industries where there are clear national security implications. But there is a risk that if that continues, if the mission creep continues unabated, or is not policed adequately enough, then I think that is a potential stress test. Australia could turn inward, and if it turns inwards, there is no future for this country without the multilateral free trading system. And we know that that is under the severest strain it could possibly be under at the moment. The WTO, you know, is probably somewhere out in, you know, a civil war battlefield with the last rites being administered. But that I see as a potential stress test. And as I say, you know, whether or not we have seen pockets of this, as I say, over the last 30 years, whether or not the sort of Anglo-Celtic core culture become, they feel under threat or under siege about their national essence. They're, I think, two of the key stress testers.
You mentioned about the sort of the policy settings. You know, there is an argument that the numbers that we see in terms of net overseas migration are essentially a function of universities, international students, but also industry labour dynamics. To what extent do you think we have agency with respect to public policy around immigration? I mean, it was demonstrated in the extreme during COVID when we were able to, you know, do that. But at a real politic level, do policymakers and politicians really have any choice?
Well, I think there's always been a very clear compact, you know, that most post-war Australian governments have kept with the Australian people, and that is that policymakers know, broadly speaking, I think, that the Australian people will accept large numbers of official migration intake as long as the politicians control the border. That, I think, you know, I mean, it was most visibly manifest, I guess, through the 90s with the introduction of mandatory detention under the Keating government, and then, of course, in the late 90s with the whole Tampa incident. And then since then, I mean, we're still, in many ways, having that debate whenever a boat appears off the coast of northern Australia, right? So long as the government keeps that part under control and secures its borders, I think the Australian population will accept a large migration intake. So I don't see any I don't see any area where that will be placed fundamentally under challenge. But I mean, it is clear when you look at the numbers that Bernard put up there about the growth, especially from India. I can't see any reason why that would sort of not continue unabated, to be honest. Yeah.
In terms of you talked about the long-term productivity. Bernard's long the agri sector. That's not really what a knowledge economy looks like. Large numbers of the people that come here. If they come through the student channel, they come to acquire degrees in STEM. They don't see Australia as this, feeding the rest of Asia. To what extent are our immigration patterns, the way we're handling that human capital, at odds with a long-term productivity agenda, or do you think they're aligned?
Oh, look.
Aged care, healthcare, they're not big on productivity. They
No.
are, large numbers of people going into healthcare, they're low productivity sectors. Let me give you an example. Bernard wants to export $1,000 worth of value add to the rest of the world. That's a lot of unprocessed wheat going out through Fremantle.
Yeah.
Other countries that are on that list, we may criticize France, but the way you create $1,000 worth of value added in France is you send the drawings for a pair of Christian Louboutin shoes to somebody in China, and they send you back $1,000 worth of shoes. The way the US does it is they send the recipe for an iPhone to Foxconn, and you get back a $2,000 phone. Like, at some point in time, the move to being a quaternary economy has to happen, doesn't it?
Look, I think Bernard might be better placed to answer that question than me. To be
Well,
honest.
yeah, I get that. Healthcare and aged care is not generally highly productive workers. However, we kind of need them. If you're going to have a baby boom in the 1950s, you can't abandon them in the 2020s and 2030s. So I'm sorry, we have a moral duty, ethical duty to do that. And if it's not the kind of work that native Australians want to do, then we need to do that. And we need to find a model that actually works. So Filipinos and Nepalese say, well, it's not. It's a way I can get into a first world country and I'll work my butt off the way the Greeks and the Italians did in the 1960s, and my son the doctor, my daughter the lawyer. That was the social contract between the Greeks and the Italians, that first generation of migrants, working 3, 4, 5 jobs, whatever it takes. And the kids knew it in the 1970s and 1980s. They had to produce, the Melbourne University, Sydney University degree and prosper. It was vindication of their decision to come to Australia. That was the driving force. That was the social contract, in fact. And yes, in my whole point about housing and lifestyle, whatever, it's not that it's all happy. It went far from it. I can't get my house, therefore it's someone's fault. I have a birthright to get that house. And you'd have to argue, well, their parents did it and their parents did it, in fact. So there's reason for that. And if you look at the number of people lining up to come to Australia from each of those places, then the feedback channels must be giving, well, actually, it does have its problems. There is this and that and whatever. But overall, the quality of life, the possibility of owning your own home, the possibility of raising a family, of living in peace, of having good health care, having access to education, access to travel, having an alfresco space, all that sort of stuff must be sufficiently reasonable to have those people line up year after year.
Can I take you back, James? The inflection points in immigration policy. Generally, you as an outsider, you look back over Australian economic liberalisation. It was largely a phenomenon of that whole Keating era. You talked about people within foreign affairs, the public servants within that, gently nudging over decades.
Yeah.
What do you think were those key inflection points? As you said, at one point in time, we've got an exclusion policy. There are troops on the ground in Vietnam. There's a Cold War. There are these real tensions.
Yeah.
What do you think are the sort of inflection points that allow those changes to happen?
So the key one is, there's often sort of argy-bargy between the political parties as to who really buried white Australia. The Whitlam government often gets the credit because of that dramatic statement by Al Grasby, the Minister of Immigration, who said, the policy is dead, give me a shovel and I'll bury it. But I I think it's a bipartisan endeavour. And as I said, the 1967 decision by the Holt government to just leave the door at least a little bit ajar in terms of allowing non-European migrants to come in, that was the real moment at which the great white walls of white Australia started to tumble. Now, that continued through the Whitlam government, but for mine, it's the Fraser government. That's the biggest one, because Fraser faces the test at the end of the Vietnam War, the fall of Saigon and Vietnamese refugees, and Fraser believes Australia has a moral obligation to accept refugees from South Vietnam. He does that in large numbers, and that policy, let's not forget, is opposed by both Whitlam and Hawke. I won't repeat in this company what Whitlam actually said. I'm sure many people know it, that he wasn't going to have effing Vietnamese bolts in the community who he thought would be an immediate constituency who would vote for the coalition. Hawke believed that they would take Australian workers' jobs. Now then, of course, you have, I think, bear in mind that in the period in which these inflection points are happening, Australians had and their policymakers had a view that Asia wasn't a threat, that the next 10 to 15 years would be relatively strategically benign. China wasn't a fear, Indonesia wasn't a fear, the Chinese were in a scrap in the late 70s with Vietnam, but, Geoffrey Blainey has made this point, the sort of placid pond that Australian policymakers looked out at over the 70s and 80s was quite unlike anything in its history. For those 2 decades, there was no real fear of Asia. And this, of course, is when the Hawke government in the 80s publishes 4 key reports, about all of them really directed towards integrating or embedding or enmeshing Australia more closely with Asia. And, the Garneau report on the Northeast Asian economic ascendancy, the Fitzgerald report on immigration, the Ingleson report on higher education. I'm forgetting the other one, I can't remember it now. But, Hawke as well, they're all, in a way, trying to bed down this idea of what tolerance means. And Hawke, towards the end of the 80s says, immigrants from over 120 or 130 countries have come to Australia attracted by our British heritage. Bob Hawke says that, a Labor Prime Minister. And, in his Australia Day speech in 1988, he says, to be Australian is to have a commitment to Australia, right? So a key part of, I think, why the policy has worked is because successive governments have emptied out anything that's intolerant or exclusivist or chauvinist or national or overtly nationalistic. Now, as I said in the start, that's left a question of what does it actually mean to be Australian. As I said, there's a lot of hair pulling about this. But for mine, it's Malcolm Fraser. That's the first real test of the end of white Australia. That's the key moment.
And when you move to more contemporary era, the unwillingness of politicians to create space on the far right, they're very clearly saying that's not who we are. Abbott, others.
Yes, Abbott deserves credit for fighting Hanson. He was more vocal than I think any of his colleagues in the late 90s and early 2000s in taking on Pauline Hanson. Yeah, I think there is a real sense in Australia's political tradition that goes back nearly 100 years now, that anyone who's popped their head up above the parapet and engaged in a kind of a snarling nationalism has tended to come unstuck. And so there is a sense in which the centre of tolerance is holding. Now, that's been put under enormous strain recently with the anti-Semitism on the rise, there's no question about that. But as I said, those previous pockets of questioning, of multiculturalism or criticising the immigration intake or, Hanson talking about the formation of ghettos, the political culture has been able to respond. Now, I'm not saying that those moments were not uncomfortable. And the recent period of bilateral tensions with China was not comfortable for Chinese Australians at all. And the voting in the electorates of outer Sydney and Melbourne are testament to that, as is Mr Dutton's amazing transformation on what he wants from the relationship with China. But there is something that is held fundamentally about tolerance of diversity. I'm not trying to paint a uniformly happy picture, but nevertheless, you know, compared to other post-imperial societies, this country is held together pretty well. Some of them have nearly broken apart. Canada nearly broke apart in the late 90s with those referenda. Now, admittedly, that was a bicultural thing with the Quebecois. But nevertheless, yes, your point about the politicians, though, this is where... See, now, when I'm listening to Bernard, now, there is, I think, so many of the ingredients which I think Australian people these days are desperate to hear from their political class. There is no politician that I can see that is actually articulating or setting out a kind of a roadmap for where this country needs to go, what kind of reforms need to be taking place, what type of businesses we need to be focusing on for the future to try and give an uptick in productivity. For some reason, that kind of politics has fallen out altogether. Now, that could be because of the quality of politicians we have. I don't think I've heard a single speech from Albanese that I would say that needs to be in a compendium of Australian political rhetoric that really says something about the country. Now, I don't know, I don't have the explanation for this. You know, I mean, I'm torn because I think Bernard's right. I don't think Australians really give a crap sometimes. They don't need the purple prose of an American president. I think that's a delightful thing about the country, actually. And sometimes when some political leaders have spoken in those very, you know, flowery tones, the public want to throw a brick at them.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our two speakers tonight. Thank you very much.